Retired Master Chief Petty Officer Augustus Gus Kelly stands on the deck of the USS Intrepid Museum, holding his grandson's hand as they read the memorial plaques together. A young security officer approaches with authority he hasn't earned and says the words that will haunt him forever. "Sir, you need to leave this ship immediately. This area is for real Navy personnel only." Gus looks down at the boy whose father died serving this country, then back at the officer and quietly responds, "Son, I helped build this very deck you're standing on." At 67 years old, Augustus Kelly moves with the measured dignity of a man who spent 32 years serving his country at sea. His thick gray beard and weathered hands tell stories of storms weathered and battles won, but his gentle eyes reveal the grandfather he's become since retiring to a small coastal town in Maine. Every Saturday morning for the past 3 years, he's driven 2 hours to New York City to visit the USS Intrepid Museum with his 8-year-old grandson, Tommy. Tommy's father, Gus's son, Michael, was killed in Afghanistan 2 years ago, leaving behind a boy who barely remembers his dad's voice. These museum visits have become sacred time for both of them, where Gus shares stories of naval service and Tommy asks endless questions about ships and sailors. The old Master Chief has found new purpose in these moments, passing down not just family history, but the values that defined his generation. His expertise in naval engineering and his deep knowledge of the ship's systems made him invaluable during the restoration process. If you want to hear more incredible stories about the heroes who built this country, please subscribe to our channel and share these stories with others who need to remember what real service looks like. Gus enlisted in the Navy straight out of high school in 1973, when the Vietnam War was winding down, but the Cold War was heating up. He spent his early years as a machinist's mate on destroyers patrolling the Mediterranean, learning that the ocean doesn't care about your rank or your politics. It only respects competence and courage. By 1978, he'd made it aboard the USS Intrepid during her final deployment. The old aircraft carrier was already showing her age, but she was still a formidable piece of American naval power. Gus worked in the engine room, keeping the massive turbines running that pushed 90,000 tons of steel through the world's oceans. He learned every pipe, every valve, every bolt that held that ship together. The defining moment of his naval career came during a storm in the North Atlantic when the ship's main power plant failed. While officers argued about procedures, Gus crawled through scalding steam and toxic fumes to manually restart the emergency generators. His actions saved the ship and 800 lives, earning him the Navy Commendation Medal and the respect of every sailor who served with him. After the Intrepid was decommissioned, Gus continued serving on other ships, eventually rising to Master Chief Petty Officer. He retired with a chest full of ribbons and the knowledge that he'd spent his life in service to something greater than himself. But the Intrepid never left his heart. When they converted her to a museum, he volunteered his expertise to help preserve her for future generations. Officer Blake Morrison was 26 years old and had been working security at the Intrepid Museum for exactly 3 months. He'd never served in the military, never been to sea, and never learned the difference between authority and respect. On this particular Saturday morning, he was having a bad day and looking for someone to take it out on. Morrison noticed the old man and the young boy spending what he considered too much time reading the memorial plaques. In his limited experience, visitors were supposed to move quickly through exhibits, not linger and actually absorb the history. When he saw Gus pointing out details on various displays and explaining things that weren't written on the information cards, Morrison decided the old man was disrupting the flow of visitors. The confrontation began when Morrison approached Gus and Tommy near the ship's island superstructure. Without introducing himself or asking questions, he immediately ordered them to move along. When Gus politely explained that he was sharing naval history with his grandson, Morrison became more aggressive. He claimed that Gus was providing unauthorized information and potentially confusing other visitors. The situation escalated when Tommy asked his grandfather about the memorial wall dedicated to sailors who died in service. As Gus knelt down to show the boy his father's name engraved on a plaque, Morrison interrupted with the demand that would change everything. He told Gus that the area was restricted to real Navy personnel only, and that civilians needed to move along immediately. The words hit Gus like a physical blow. Here he was, trying to honor his son's memory and teach his grandson about sacrifice, and this young man was treating him like a trespasser on a ship he'd helped save and later preserve. Other visitors began to notice the commotion, and Tommy started to cry, confused about why they were being treated badly. Morrison made it worse by suggesting that if Gus had actually served in the Navy, he would understand the importance of following orders. The implication was clear: this old man was lying about his service, using it to gain access to areas where he didn't belong. Gus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with deep anger, the same feeling he'd experienced 40 years ago when incompetent officers put good sailors at risk. But this was different. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about Tommy, who was looking up at his grandfather with scared, confused eyes, wondering why the nice man in the uniform was being so mean. Standing there on the deck where he'd once worked 18-hour shifts to keep America safe, Gus thought about his son, Michael. The boy had been so proud to follow in his father's footsteps, enlisting in the Army right after high school. Michael had died believing in something bigger than himself, just like his father had taught him. Now his son was being remembered on a memorial wall, and some punk security guard was treating that memorial like his personal territory. Gus also thought about all the sailors he'd served with over the years, men who died in training accidents, in combat, in the simple act of keeping the peace through strength. Their memories were preserved in this museum, and this young man was treating their service like it was just another tourist attraction to be managed and controlled. The rage was there, burning in his gut like it had during the worst storms at sea. But Gus had learned something in 32 years of naval service that Morrison would never understand. Real strength isn't about showing your power over others. It's about knowing when and how to use that power effectively. This situation required precision, not force. He looked down at Tommy, wiped the boy's tears, and made a decision that would teach his grandson more about honor and dignity than any museum display ever could. Gus calmly asked Morrison for his supervisor's name and contact information. When Morrison refused and became more belligerent, Gus pulled out his phone and began recording the interaction. Other visitors started gathering around, some of them recognizing the injustice of the situation, others just curious about the commotion. Morrison panicked when he saw the phone. He'd already violated several museum policies by failing to de-escalate the situation and by making assumptions about visitors without cause. Now he was being recorded, and he could see other people taking out their phones as well. His supervisor had specifically warned all security staff about the importance of treating visitors with respect, especially veterans and military families. The young officer doubled down on his authority, threatening to have Gus arrested for trespassing and disorderly conduct. He radioed for backup and demanded that Gus delete the recording. When Gus refused, Morrison made his biggest mistake. He reached for the phone, attempting to take it by force. The moment Morrison touched Gus's phone, several things happened at once. Other visitors began shouting at the security officer to leave the old man alone. A Navy veteran in the crowd stepped forward and identified himself, backing up Gus's account of the situation. Most importantly, Morrison's supervisor arrived and immediately recognized that his employee had created a public relations disaster. But Gus wasn't finished. He pulled out his wallet and showed Morrison his military ID card, his Veterans Administration card, and a faded photograph of himself standing on the very deck where they were now arguing. He explained quietly that he'd served aboard this ship when it was still active duty, and that he'd later worked as a contractor during the museum's restoration. Morrison's face went white as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He was arguing with a man who had more right to be on this ship than almost anyone alive. But instead of apologizing, he made one final error in judgment. He claimed that Gus's credentials could be fake and that anyone could print fake military IDs. That's when Gus decided to make some phone calls. Within 20 minutes, Gus had contacted 3 people who would change Blake Morrison's life forever. The first was Captain Sarah Chen, the current director of the Intrepid Museum, who knew Gus personally from his work during the restoration. The second was Admiral Patricia Williams, retired, who had served as Gus's commanding officer during his final years of service and now sat on the museum's board of directors. The third was Michael Torres, an investigative reporter for a major New York newspaper who specialized in stories about veterans' issues. Captain Chen arrived first, and her face showed a mixture of embarrassment and fury when she saw what was happening. She immediately apologized to Gus and Tommy, then ordered Morrison to her office. Admiral Williams arrived 30 minutes later, and her presence commanded respect from everyone in the area. When she saw Gus, she embraced him like the old friend he was and asked about his grandson. The Admiral then did something that Morrison would never forget. She asked Gus to give her and Tommy a personal tour of the ship's engineering spaces, areas that were normally off-limits to visitors. As they walked through the corridors where Gus had once worked, the Admiral explained to Tommy how his grandfather had saved the ship during that storm in 1978, and how his heroism had become part of the Intrepid's official history. Morrison was suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. But the real turning point came when Michael Torres arrived and began interviewing witnesses. The reporter had covered military issues for 15 years, and he recognized a story that would resonate with readers across the country: a veteran being disrespected at a memorial site while trying to honor his fallen son. The story went viral within hours of being published. Social media exploded with support for Gus and condemnation of Morrison's behavior. The museum received hundreds of calls and emails demanding accountability. Military veterans organizations rallied around the story, using it as an example of how service members and their families were being treated in modern America. But the most powerful moment came when Tommy asked his grandfather why the man had been so mean to them. Gus knelt down, looked his grandson in the eyes, and explained that sometimes people forget what real service looks like. He told Tommy that his father had died protecting the right of everyone to be treated with dignity, including people who didn't understand the value of that sacrifice. The museum's board of directors met in emergency session the next day. Morrison was fired, and new policies were implemented requiring all staff to receive training on military history and veterans issues. But more importantly, they established the Michael Kelly Memorial Fund, named after Gus's son, to provide free educational programs for children of fallen service members. Blake Morrison's dismissal was just the beginning of his consequences. The viral nature of the story meant that his name became associated with disrespecting veterans, making it nearly impossible for him to find work in security or any field dealing with the public. He eventually left New York and took a job in a warehouse, far from any situation where he might encounter military personnel or their families. The Intrepid Museum used the incident as a catalyst for positive change. They established Gus as a volunteer historical consultant, allowing him to share his expertise with visitors who wanted to learn more about naval history. The museum also created a special program where children of fallen service members could receive free admission and private tours led by actual veterans. Tommy became something of a celebrity among the museum staff, and his Saturday visits with his grandfather turned into educational experiences for other families. Gus would often find himself surrounded by children asking questions about ships and sailors, and he discovered that teaching young people about service was as rewarding as the service itself had been. The Michael Kelly Memorial Fund grew beyond anyone's expectations, eventually providing college scholarships for children of fallen service members. Tommy was its first recipient, though he wouldn't need the money for another 10 years. The fund became a lasting tribute to service and sacrifice, turning a moment of disrespect into a legacy of honor. Most importantly, the incident strengthened the bond between Gus and Tommy. The boy learned that his grandfather wasn't just a kind old man who told good stories, but a genuine hero who had served his country with distinction. Tommy started telling his classmates about his grandfather's service, carrying forward the family tradition of honoring those who came before. The story also had a broader impact on how veterans were treated at museums and memorial sites across the country. Other institutions reviewed their policies and training programs, ensuring that their staff understood the importance of treating all visitors, especially veterans and military families, with the respect they deserved. Gus never sought revenge against Morrison, but he did use the incident to teach Tommy about the difference between authority and leadership. Real leaders, he explained, earned respect through their actions and treated others with dignity. People who relied on their position or uniform to command respect usually lost both in the end. True respect cannot be demanded or enforced through authority alone. It must be earned through service, sacrifice, and the consistent demonstration of character under pressure. Gus Kelly understood this principle because he'd lived it for 32 years at sea, and he passed that understanding to his grandson through his response to injustice. The greatest victories are often won not through confrontation, but through the quiet demonstration of dignity in the face of disrespect. Gus could have used his physical strength or his connections to destroy Blake Morrison immediately, but instead he chose to respond with the measured professionalism that had defined his naval career. In doing so, he turned a moment of humiliation into a teachable moment for his grandson and a catalyst for positive change. Legacy isn't just about what we accomplish in our own lives, but about how we prepare the next generation to carry forward our values. Tommy Kelly will grow up knowing that his grandfather was a hero, not because someone told him so, but because he witnessed that heroism firsthand. The boy learned that real strength comes from knowing when to fight and when to build, when to stand firm and when to show mercy. The memorial wall on the USS Intrepid contains thousands of names representing thousands of stories of service and sacrifice. Each name represents a family, a legacy, and a commitment to something greater than individual interest. Those who honor that commitment, like Gus Kelly, understand that service doesn't end with retirement. It continues in every act of teaching, every moment of mentorship, and every example of dignity under pressure. Some lessons can only be taught through example, and some truths can only be learned through experience. On that Saturday morning aboard the Intrepid, a young security officer learned that respect must be earned, and a young boy learned what it really means to be proud of your family's service to something greater than yourself.